Hi everyone. I wanted to take this time to go over Genesis 38, which was part of your assigned reading from the homework. So I hope you've had a chance to look at it at least, and if not, I'm going to actually be reading it to you today. So if you haven't had a chance to look at it, you'll get it now. This is an interesting story because it is a good illustration for many of the concepts about Israelite society that we've been talking about so far in this class. And I wanted to use it as a means of talking about some of these different aspects of the story. It's probably not one that you covered on the felt board in Sunday school because some of the content is a little racy, but I hope that you've enjoyed reading through it and have learned something from it. So I'm going to be reading Genesis 38, beginning at verse 1, and I'm reading from the NRSV. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and settled near a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He married her and went into her. Now, when the Bible says he went into her, it means they had sex, just so you know that. She conceived and bore a son, and he named him Again she conceived and bore a son whom she named Onan. And yet again she bore a son, and she named him Shelah. And she was in Chebez when she bore him. So we have, in this story so far, we have Judah. Make a little chart here, so we might need it later. Judah and Shua. See how her name is spelled, Shua. And they have 3 sons. So we have Onan, and Shelah. So the chart, if you can see this, looks something like this. Judah and Shua, and 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. So Judah's doing very well. He has 3 sons, which is pretty good insurance that at least one of them will be around to take care of him in his old age and to take over the household when he gets to be too old to do so. So everything starts off fine, just like it does in most stories. Then continuing in verse 6, Judah took a wife for his firstborn. So notice that Judah picks the wife for So this is an arranged marriage, and her name was Tamar. So Tamar becomes one of the main characters in the story. So we have, Judah and Shua and and Tamar. So the first son is married off. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Now we don't really know what was wrong with and we don't really know that the characters in the story definitely know that he was put to death. But anyway, he dies. So this leaves Tamar to be a widow, right? So that's important. Then, continuing in verse 8, then Judah said to Onan, go in to your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, raise up offspring for your brother. But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he went in to his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. So what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. So Onan goes as well. So all we have left is Shelah in the end. Now, what is going on here exactly? So what is Onan doing or not doing? So this is part of a custom called levirate marriage, which is discussed in Deuteronomy 25. So thinking again about the nature of the household, if a woman is widowed and doesn't have any offspring, this is going to leave her completely vulnerable and unattached in society. So it's really imperative for a woman to have offspring, and you see this need expressed over and over again, particularly in the book of Genesis. So Onan is supposed to go in and have sex with his sister in law in order to get her pregnant so that she has offspring. Now, the text reminds us that these are not Onan's kids, these are sort of the symbolic kids of the first brother. And that's really an important thing. This text has been used for generations to condemn masturbation, but it's really not about that at all. And actually, I think in maybe the Catholic tradition, masturbation is still sometimes referred to as onanism, named after this guy, poor guy. So, thinking about the chart here again, who is responsible for obtaining the inheritance? Well, the inheritance goes typically one half to the firstborn, as we mentioned last week, and then divided up among the other brothers. So really would be entitled to the inheritance, but he's gone before Onan comes on the scene. And Onan thinks, if my sister-in-law has more kids, they will actually take my brother's place to be first in line for the inheritance. So I'm going to kind of cheat on my duties here. And if she doesn't have any kids, then hey, Onan's going to be first in line. So this isn't really a story about masturbation at all. It's actually a story about greed and making sure that you get what's coming to you. So, and in the meantime, here's Tamar stuck, no kids, extremely risky situation for her. So, continuing in 11, then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up, for he feared that he too would die like his brothers. So he's thinking in his mind that, there's something wrong with this Tamar woman. All my sons are getting killed off that end up with her. And now Judah's getting a little desperate because he sees he only has one son left. And if his remaining son dies, then what's ultimately going to happen to him? So Tamar goes to live in her father's house, which I imagine would have been a somewhat shameful experience for her, because this is like buying something at Walmart and then sending it back because it's defective. Remember, her father would have received money in exchange for her hand, and now she's getting sent back. But as we'll see, Judah still seems to be calling the shots. So he is still the master of the Beit Av that we talked about last week, the house of the father. So Judah is still the one saying how things are going to go. So, in the course of time, this is verse 12, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died, and when Judah's time of mourning was over, he went up to Timnah with the sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going to Timnah to shear his sheep, she put on her widow's garments, put on a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat down in the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. She saw that Shelah had grown up, yet she had not been given to him in marriage. So there's really only 3 people left who haven't died in the story, and that is Tamar, Shelah, and Judah. And Judah is not marrying Tamar off to his youngest son, so she's pretty much stuck. So she dresses up like a prostitute. For some reason in the Bible, disguises always work, so you might ask yourself, well, why didn't Judah recognize his daughter-in-law? I don't know, but it seems to work. And it's interesting that she is sitting down at the entrance to Enaim, which means 2 wells in Hebrew. So there are many stories in the Bible about men who meet their wives at wells. So we already get the idea that something significant is going to happen here. So continuing in verse 15, when Judah saw her, he thought her to be a prostitute, for she had covered her face. he went over to her on the roadside and said, "Come, let me come in to you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come in to me?" He answered, "I will send you a kid from the flock." And she said, "Only if you give me a pledge until you send it." And he said, "What pledge shall I give you?" And she replied, "Your signet with your cord and the staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she got up and went away, and taking off her veil, she put back on the garments of her widowhood, we would say. So what's happening here? Judah's going down the road. He meets a woman that he thinks is a prostitute, and he's on his way to the sheep shearing festival. And apparently, whatever happens at the sheep shearing festival stays at the sheep shearing festival. I'm not sure. And he's a widower, and so he meets this woman he thinks is a prostitute and starts to negotiate. And unlike today, apparently he didn't have any money with him, or left his wallet at home or something. So the supposed prostitute says, "Well, what will you give me in payment?" And he says, "I'll give you a kid from the flock, one of the goats from the flock." But of course he doesn't have the goat with him. So how is this going to work? So she basically takes his ID and in pledge that ultimately he will follow up. So this is sort of like leaving your driver's license behind when you rent shoes at the bowling alley, or I don't know, rent a bicycle or something. So to make sure that you follow up, they take your ID, and then they know eventually you'll come back and get it. So when Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adullamite, so ultimately he knows he has to pay his pledge, but he sends his buddy to do it rather than doing it himself, which is sort of interesting. He could not find her. This is in verse 20. So he asked the townspeople, "Where is the temple prostitute who was at Enaim by the wayside?" But they said, "No prostitute has been here. We have no idea what you're talking about." So his buddy returns to Judah in verse 22 and says, "I have not found her. Moreover, the townspeople have said, 'No prostitute has been here.'" And Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own, otherwise we will be laughed at. You see, I sent this kid, but you could not find her." So Judah is saying, well, just let's let the whole thing drop, and maybe this will all just sort of go away. So, the kicker in verse 24, about 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the whore, and moreover, she is pregnant as a result of whoredom." Judah said, "Bring her out, let her be burned." Now, this is a very harsh punishment. One note on translation. I don't know who anymore says something like "plays the whore." A more accurate and contemporary translation would be "she has been promiscuous," or "she has had sex outside the bounds of who she may have sex with." But in any event, Judah says, "Bring her out, let her be burned," which is a punishment that we've never, I don't think, ever hear otherwise in the Bible. Very, very harsh. But it's very clear that Judah is still in charge of the situation, even though Tamar has gone back to live with her father. And continuing in verse 25, as she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "It was the owner of these who made me pregnant." So she produces the IDs, and she said, "Take note, please, whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." So whose are these, O man who's accusing me? And then Judah acknowledged them and said, "She is more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." So in this case, we see that Judah has also not fulfilled his responsibilities to his daughter-in-law, just like his son Onan didn't fulfill his responsibilities. And it says he did not lie with her again. So the gig is up. Judah is shown to be the father, and he takes responsibility for the pregnancy. And then a few more verses, beginning in 27. When the time of her delivery came, there were twins in her womb. When she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and bound on his hand a crimson thread, saying, "This one came out first." But then he drew back his hand, and out came his brother. And she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore, he was named Perez, and in Hebrew, Peretz is to make a breach or make a hole, like a hole in a wall if you're invading a city. Afterward, his brother came out with a crimson thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah, and Zerah is a word for crimson. So Tamar ends up with twin boys, which is kind of like winning the biblical jackpot in the ancient world. So even though she went from being a very vulnerable person, she now has two boys to look after her. And Judah has his two boys, and Onan, replaced, basically, or restored. So he can rest easier in his old age as well. So what can we learn from this story in terms of social history of the Israelites? Well, we can see clear examples of patriarchy. So patriarchy basically means having the men be in charge, or having men making the rules, which is basically true of Israelite society, no doubt, but it's not exactly the whole story. So elsewhere in her book, in a part that I didn't make you read, Carol Myers talks about a concept called heterarchy, and she spells it like this. I don't know if you can see that, heterarchy, which basically means literally other power. So even though Tamar has little or no control over her sexuality, she uses her intelligence to outwit her father-in-law and brings the story to a conclusion that's beneficial for both of them. So it's not that women are completely powerless pawns in the Bible, even though men are calling the shots quite often. They do have their own type of power, and I think that's an important idea to balance out the idea of patriarchy in the Bible. And we can think of other women in the Bible who have plenty of power, women who seem otherwise fairly powerless, like Sarah, for example. If you read the story of Sarah and Abraham, and she gets into conflicts with her maidservant, Abraham says, "Hey, you're in charge of these internal affairs, you take care of it." So Sarah easily exercises power there. In the story of Isaac and Jacob and Esau, that end up fooling their father Isaac, we can see that Jacob's mother, Rebecca, exercises a great deal of power in that story. Now, she has to be a little, I guess for lack of a better word, sneaky, but she does have power. So Carol Myers refers to this sort of subversive power as heterarchy, and I think that's an important idea in our reading of the Bible. Thanks. I hope you enjoyed this story, and if you have questions about it, please post those to Moodle, and have a great rest of the day. See you soon. Bye.